first off, we're here at the Outspoken podcast. So I wanted to ask, what are you most outspoken about in education? What is it that you wish everyone working in the space would understand?
There's so many things, but I will start with this big one, which is that our public schools, the fact that they get the lackluster results that we get upset about, and it excludes so many students from further education and opportunity, frankly, the schools were designed to do exactly what they do. They were designed as sorting systems to educate, by just broadcasting the same content to the same group of students based on their age. And then some students would get it, they would move on. Some students wouldn't, they would drop out, move into jobs. And of course, that was great for a while, but in a knowledge economy, as we are in now, just doesn't work, right? Like, we need all individuals to build mastery, certainly of foundational concepts, but then have the ability to explore and understand who am I and what's my purpose and passion. And so, at that point, you sort of need a system that prioritizes the mastery for every single learner and then personalizes for the fact that we're all unique. And today's system was explicitly built to do the opposite of those things.
That makes total sense, though. I've got to follow up on that, but I also reflect, in system thinking, it says that, systems are designed to do exactly what you observe as being their output. And so we shouldn't be surprised with these results. And yet we continually are. But that leads me to a follow-on. What are the blockers to addressing this? What are the blockers to change? Because I know you have been advocating for the need for change in various ways and these observations for a while. So what is it that's holding back system change?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think there's different ways to think about it. On the one hand, right, we know that organizations, as they become successful and then solidified and then calcified, are very, very hard to change, right? Their value proposition, their resources, their processes, their revenue formula, they all reinforce each other. They become very difficult to say, okay, the whole system is built around sorting and, monolithic standardized instruction. We're going to move to mastery and customization, right? Like, that is anathema to every single part of the enterprise. And so I think part of the challenge we've had is, like, we'll tweak a policy here or there, but then it just bumps into something else in the culture or processes, right, or whatever else. And so I think one of the biggest is, frankly, our own success as a nation with a universal education system that's compulsory has made it really difficult to move beyond it. I think the second thing is we've sort of had a lack of imagination when students opt out of that system to create an alternative world in which they can showcase what they've learned in a variety of different ways, right? And sort of build a representation of mastery across lots of different projects and subject areas, et cetera, so that they can use that as a credential, in effect, to decide, do I want to go to college? Do I want to work? Do I want to do these gig projects? Whatever it might be, right? And I think we've had a failure of imagination of really building a system around those individuals that allows them to do so. And then, frankly, I think making it easier for families to be able to opt into that different world. We've sort of let the conventional guide us and lock us in place, as opposed to imagine that there could be other alternatives, I think.
Michael, last year you published From Reopen to Reinvent, Recreating School for Every Child, which talks a lot about kind of the different tools that folks who are interested in reinventing the system can leverage to that end. I was just wondering if you'd be able to share with us just what some of the key themes of the book were, and also if your thinking has changed at all in the past year from when you published it.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'll just say this because of the podcast we're on. When that book came out, in some ways, this is me looking at the pandemic, much like you guys, I think, in some way, right? Like, this is the chance to really reinvent how education works. It's like people are thinking differently. And I was like, okay, I'm going to throw every single tool and exasperation and excitement that I have at educators to say, like, you can make these changes. You can move, and some of the big ideas, move away from a zero-sum system to a positive sum system where each child's success doesn't come at the expense of another child's. You can move to a mastery-based learning environment. We can move to team teaching environments. We can allow entities like OutSchool, right, to build a much more robust sense of choice and recreate schools as really community centers to provide the right in-person supports for learners. We can really rethink what's the progress that parents need as they move into these schooling communities for their kids. And the fact that, the modern workforce looks nothing like what it did when schools were created. I mean, I don't know who would create everyone's like, oh, schools are for childcare. And you're like, who would create an 8 to 3 p.m. childcare option? That's the dumbest thing I can think of. And so it was really like, okay, let's do it. And I think, to the question, Justin, and despite all the things I just said to Amir about why we struggle to do this, here's how we can create autonomous organizations or schools within schools, or districts could create their own micro schools so that they can create the space and they don't have to overthrow the paradigm for everyone all at once, but just try some small things in different places. And I think it was trying to give the language to that. I think what we've seen in the pandemic, even with the federal funds, is largely we've used it to do business as usual and try to get back to the status quo as quick as possible. And so I don't know if that's a change in my thinking, except it's maybe a greater exasperation that we haven't seen more educators empowered to do things differently and rethink education. And I think I've probably, I was really intrigued with micro schools well before the pandemic. I was really intrigued with education savings accounts, but I don't know that I was a full-throated, they're important sort of person. I think I've become more so since the pandemic because I don't know how else we're going to get from here to there for families and kids.
Michael, touching on that, I mean, I'm just curious. I think a lot of people are starting to change their perspective on microschools and ESAs. I think particularly as we get more and more evidence in the field about just even the folks who are using it and also their impact. I'm just curious as to what have been the biggest kind of anecdotes or the biggest data that has changed your opinion on micro schools and ESAs?
Yeah, great question. Micro schools, I was excited from day one because they sort of seemed like the one-room schoolhouse meets homeschooling meets blended learning, which are all sort of my babies combined together to create a really supportive community and personalized experience for learners. I think what I've been surprised by and excited by, frankly, I've seen from you all, at outschool.org, some of the groups that you've supported in Detroit, right, with the Black Mothers for Homeschooling there, Bernita Bradley, and some of that work you all have done, is that I think I initially framed it, this is going to be for what I would call the most overserved students. So they have a lot of means, they don't need the school that offers band, chorus, athletics, right? They want the right activity for their child, and they want the ability to choose and customize that. And who has that ability to do that if not those with lots of resources and so forth? I think what's been really interesting is, particularly as ESAs come in, but even without them, the families that are opting for these options don't fit, right? That sort of preconceived notion I had in my head. It's a much more, and I mean this in a very broad way, it's a much more diverse group of individuals along all lines that you can imagine. How they think, the type of education they value, their political beliefs, their race, their income, right? It's a much more diverse movement and a much more dynamic movement that's, I think, pretty exciting. I will tell you the one worry I have is that we've seen a lot of educators start these micro schools, which is great. I don't know that I imagined that there'd be this much education entrepreneurship from teachers. I think it's terrific that they're doing it. But my one worry is that a lot of these schools they are creating are not sustainable businesses. They're a side project that I'm willing to opt out of a living wage for 2 years to do. and then I don't know. And so I feel like we have to really build something that is sustainable. And that might mean like you take 20 kids instead of 10 kids into your micro school, right? It might mean little things just to make it sustainable and work, I think are really important at this moment in time so that the supply doesn't collapse on the very evident demand from all sorts of families for this sort of education.
That makes total sense in terms of creating sustainable change and what needs to happen to drive that forward. I'd love us to put these recent trends with ESAs, education savings accounts, and micro schools into kind of the longer range context of what you see happening in the space. And that brings me back to a book I read that 15 years ago that you wrote with Clayton Christensen on disrupting class, and was very influential in my thinking on education and in founding Outschool. You wrote that book a while ago. I'm curious as to how you see progress since that book and how your thinking has changed since that book.
Yeah, good question. It's interesting, right? Because we wrote Disrupting Class much as Clay wrote The Innovator's Solution. So Clay's first book was The Innovator's Dilemma, which is basically like, if you do everything right, managers, you're screwed, but it's not your fault, right? And so Innovator's Solution was like, okay, so how do you innovate if you're the existing organization and leader in a field to catch the disruption? And Disrupting Class was written with the same intention and desire. And in the same way From Reopen to Reinvent was like, how do I help existing public school educators and schools themselves, right, adapt and be able to customize the education that kids need, right, to make progress. And I guess what I would say is the theoretical underpinnings of that book, when I go back and read it, I'm like, wow, we were really prescient. We predicted exactly why schools wouldn't be able to do X, Y, or Z. But then we almost like looked beyond it and we're like, but it'll happen anyway because we were very optimistic, I think. And so it's interesting in some ways. Like the disruption we were predicting was more the rise of digital over analog and print, I think, and that's clearly happened. I mean, the textbook companies, right, are on their heels, and I think our hope was that people would use it to. We didn't actually use the word personalize, but we used the word customize in the book. But that they would personalize for kids' different learning needs at different times. And I think we said, and the way you do that is not by going into the core. You do it on these fringes, these areas of non-consumption, like what you've done, frankly. And then I think the vast majority of people who read the book like ignored that second half of the statement and just like, we're like, but we've got to solve, 7th grade middle school math. I totally agree. But like, that's not how disruption occurs, right? And so in some ways, I think some of the central messages of the book weren't really followed, even as the broader disruption it described, independent of the normative question, like has occurred, if that makes sense. And so it's like a weird, when I read it, I sort of feel like, yeah, we got a lot right in that book. And it didn't quite have the impact that the ultimate impact I think that I had hoped for at the same time. So it's almost like, I don't even know how to describe that, Amir. Like it's a really, I mean, and it inspired a ton of entrepreneurs, which I think is awesome, right? Like it inspired a lot of people to create incredible solutions. And it has moved the needle, but not like quite as much or in the ways that I think we said.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And it makes me wonder whether what we're seeing now with microschools and ESAs is that more disruptive movement that's happening outside of the traditional education system. Because, I was talking to some of our investors the other day, how much, should we seek to serve these ESA funds? How much should we invest? Because, sometimes in the past, school choice programs have come and gone. And I made the point that if not ESAs, there'll need to be something else, because I unfortunately, I don't see the pressures on traditional education easing up anytime soon. And so that those pressures will need to find outlet valves. So,
I mean, on that front, I remember the first or second conversation you and I had, where we talked about, you were getting traction among homeschoolers, and you sort of were like, well, this seems like the disruptive area. And I was like, it does. The problem is that historically, like, we've done the S-curve calculations we did on online learning, and it caps out at roughly 10% of like the maximum population that can contemplate a homeschool experience. And there just hadn't been this policy in place, right? And then over time, I think I've seen it as you have, which is the ESAs actually create a mechanism to bring many more families into that possible universe. And what I think is, and what I hope is different about them compared to, say, vouchers or compared to, say, tax credit scholarships, is that fundamentally it is actually creating an account for the learners and the families themselves, that they get to customize what they want to do with it. And they have an incentive to save dollars if, like, they don't see a service, right, that's gonna do what they need to make progress on, right? Like, they can actually look for value in the system. Whereas like a voucher, it's like a ticket and you can only be used on school. And so it's much more limiting. And I think it's far less empowering, I think, for the families themselves in ways that to me feel, and I think are being borne out as qualitatively different in terms of the political movement. Now, I think as we record this today, it's like 13 or 14 states have some form of ESAs in place. What's interesting is most of them, people will quickly note, they're red states. But I think what's really interesting is underneath that, and Justin, this goes sort of to the question you asked right before, is, yeah, but the education entrepreneurs who are creating the micro schools, like, I think the majority of them are like progressive politics, right? So, and these things can live with, like, two things can live with each other that aren't quite right. And that's what's so exciting, I think, about this, is these sort of realities that are emerging in these funny little brethrens. And frankly, the biggest movements in ed reform have been when unlikely fellows got together and said, we got to create some change. And I think this might be it. And it feels more enduring, at least in these states so far to me, than does the vouchers and other things like that. And the micro schools, like, if we lived in a world of true non-consumption where schooling wasn't compulsory, there's no question they would be the disruptive innovations of our time, right? Like, they can't offer near the breadth and services of a brick and mortar comprehensive district high school, say, right? They don't have the band and the this and the that. But through technology enablers, they're able to say, hey, jump on OutSchool. You can have any course imaginable, right? Hey, we can partner with the YMCA or the, various after-school providers in the community to provide these sets of services. Hey, we can be open, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Hey, we can be open every single day of the week except for Christmas and New Year's, right? Like, it's pretty, that nimbleness, that affordability, that simplicity and convenience, I think with technology is enabling it to go up market and start to serve more and more families in more and more demanding circumstances, as you would predict. The U.S. is it's an uphill sort of march to it, but I think it's an exciting time.
Okay, and so I want to put you on the spot since this is the Outspoken podcast. So one other question before I hand back to Justin. With homeschooling, when OutSchool started, we saw that roughly 2% of the U.S. school-age population was homeschooling. Now it's grown steadily to 3%. With this new emerging alternative education ecosystem building up around microschools and ESAs, what percentage what's the opportunity for that alternative education segment in 5 to 10 years' time? What percentage of US school-age population could it serve in that time frame?
Yeah, that's a great question. My guess is that, so I don't know. I haven't done the calculations on the growth rates, and the data, as you know, are pretty unreliable at the moment. My sense, though, is the theoretical limit is much higher now, right? I think it's much higher than 10%, because essentially the reason it was 10% before was that a lot of families needed a brick and mortar safe place to send their kids for safe custodial care, Micro schools are now stepping in to fill these. They're much more flexible, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the theoretical limit, could be anyone at this point. I think that's a dramatic difference. I think the question will be a political one of the pace of the spread of ESAs. Two, I think it will be a question of the supply side, like I talked about, right? Do they really build enduring schooling models, and do they really help parents and students get their jobs done, right? The jobs to be done theory, I think, is really relevant here. And I don't think that'll be like, oh, Waldorf education versus Montessori versus what. Like, I think it's going to be much more like, hey, is my kid making progress and around a community that I trust of like-minded individuals that share my values? Or is my kid the opposite of that, right? Which is like a diverse, whole child sort of experience that's broadening their horizons? Or do I have an option for my kids struggling with X or Y or whatever, help them get out of trouble and get back on track, right? Those are the sorts of statements that I think we need to have a diverse set of options to be able to really meet that demand.
Michael, you mentioned the politics of this a few times, and I think it's really interesting just because I think doing the work that we do, particularly at outschool.org, we see kind of the political paradox of a lot of this, right? Which is working in very red states, but also with oftentimes very Black and very, minority-led organizations who are certainly on the more like liberal side of politics and of policy. And I think a lot of people are really uncomfortable with that paradox, right? Those are two very different, two groups of people who hold two very different truths sometimes or about the world. And I'm just curious as you look at the kind of the roadmap for unbundling, you've said and written that there will be no great unbundling. And I'm wondering, like, to what extent is that a matter of the policies, right, and politics of the system in which we live? And also, where do you see opportunities to kind of advance unbundling through a policy and political lens?
Yeah. So my sense is that let's just start with the states that have the education savings accounts, because that allows for the most pro-unbundling, if you will, policy, right? So my sense, though, is that because of societal expectations, number one, families still think you like go to school and you buy school, right? Like they're not thinking about really unbundling that experience. So I think one is like a default. And two is in any market, the initial products or services tend to be very interdependent and the opposite of a modular unbundled solution. They sort of tend to be very one size fits all. Come here, this central experience, we do it all for you. But as it starts to overserve and overshoot what individuals need, the individuals start to become more aware of how my needs or my preferences or my progress is different from others around me. And when that happens, they start looking for that unbundled set of solutions, that more modular, how do I piece together this with that, right? And so my sense is that right now we're sort of on the early part of that curve where people are still looking for the school solution, but that the more experience that they have with this, the more they're going to start to be able to articulate, gee, like I want to be able to have my kid go study X and have a childcare solution that like cuts across this way for my particular, frontline employee schedule or whatever it might be, right? Like, and so that is what's going to start to cause, I think, along with the maturity of the models, the unbundling to increase. And I think my point on the great unbundling is like, people are like, education savings accounts are here, like it's going to all go crazy. People aren't going to have even school. So like, I don't see that reality happening, at least in the foreseeable future. And I think the evidence suggests that. Like if you look at Florida and the spend on school tuition of their ESA, it's like 79 or something like that percent or something like that. Most people spend it first on tuition and they're like, oh, I could take piano lessons. Oh, I could take horseback riding. Oh, I could take, right? Like never thought about that before. And so it starts to pull that apart, I guess. My own belief is that we'll see more and more of that. Now, your other point is then, say I'm living in a state without that education savings account policy, and I see my friends in other states doing that. This is going to be interesting as well. I hesitate to say it out loud, but I think we're living through a political realignment right now. That's not controversial to say. We know that race is becoming less of a predictor at the moment of political party, as is income level. Education actually is the best predictor, right, of the way you vote. And I'm wondering, like, are we seeing a dramatic realignment, and those who do not support these families in having the choices they want, might they lose those voters? And that'll be part, like, I don't know what that looks like on the other side, or even what we call it on a sort of conservative to liberal line, right? But I just kind of wonder, are we seeing some sort of reshuffling that we still don't understand completely? And this is not my area. I'm not a political science guy, so I don't know. But I've worked in the space, and it just strikes me that, let me say it this way. Republicans were the party of black voters before the Southern strategy and Richard Nixon, right? And then they voting against the Civil Rights Act, Southern strategy, et cetera, blew up that support and caused all those individuals to move to the Democratic Party. Not all, but almost all. Are we at a similar inflection point, and what does that look like or mean? I don't know, but it certainly feels like you've got to be in tune with the progress that parents need and kids want. I love your both take on that as well.
That's so interesting. I appreciate you bringing in other aspects of our society, and I agree. It does feel like there's a wider inflection point. It reminds me of another book I read recently, Education in a Time Between Worlds, by Zachary Stein, who's like a philosopher of education. And that phrase, "a time between worlds," and this theory that we're seeing kind of disruption and arguably the start of system change in education, and how this relates to system change in wider society. Are we seeing the unbundling of nations? I don't know. I'm not a political scientist, but there certainly does seem to be a lot going on here. Which makes it hard to predict from kind of a policy perspective within education, or a practitioner perspective within education. Is what do we do about it? What do we do about all this change? And I guess that brings me to maybe one of the key benefits of unbundling in this macro environment, which is the kind of the flexibility and the more dynamic pulling together of resources. But I'm also conscious of some of the pitfalls. We've talked a bit about unbundling. Okay, it's not going to happen as great unbundle. There's things that are going to slow it down, but we appear to be seeing the start of unbundling, and there's going to be interesting feedback loops over time, which might speed that up. But what about some of the pitfalls? What do we risk losing when we think about unbundling?
So I'll name a couple. I mean, obviously, there's sort of the obvious ones, right? Which is, if we don't have adequate childcare or transportation or safe structures for students and families. Not that maybe our public schools always do a great job on that today, but that's something it could get worse, right? And so that's something we obviously have to attend to, and shouldn't imagine that it just gets fixed by itself. I think a second one is coherence. And I take this one seriously. It's something that I think it was the biggest pushback on disrupting class in some ways for a while, was like this deeply customized future might be completely incoherent, where like there are benefits, once you learned how to read, which I get has been controversial, sadly, in this country. But like, once you learn how to read, your background knowledge makes you a better reader, as in, understanding what you read in social studies and science and music, and like having them compound on each other makes texts more accessible to you, right? I mean, Amir, you've probably had this experience, right? Where like, I can now read an education book super fast because like, I already, like, 50% of it, I've already automated. Like, I'm not struggling through terms and concepts, right? I jump into another, body of work that I'm unfamiliar with, and it's a much slower read. Background knowledge is incredibly important, and coherence across subjects rather than atomizing, different discipline areas, is a serious question, I think. And so the coherence of one's education, I think, is something we need to be thinking about. The third one, I think, is a little subtler, but it's related, which is the learning of what I like to call habits of success. Some places like to call social emotional learning. Some places like to call non-cog skills. That's my least favorite. But, things like agency, executive function skills, growth mindset, right? And there's a lot of evidence that these skills are, or these habits, as I like to call them, are best learned in the context of your learning itself. That is, like, I can give you a module, like a 45-minute module on growth mindset. It'll help you. But the moment you're in a class where, regardless of how hard you did or didn't work, the whole class moved on after 3 weeks of a given unit, and they said you're a C student, well, guess my teacher doesn't believe in growth mindset, right? Like, it just undermines the whole thing. And so we have all these, and Carol Dweck talks about this, like, all these other things can undermine the value of an intervention. These things are best learned, though, in the context of actually doing the work itself. So I can learn growth mindset in a mastery-based environment. You get to keep working on it till you show mastery, and it shows that you can grow by hard work. That teaches you perseverance. That teaches you the value of executive function skills, planning, creating a goal, planning how you'll get there, doing the work, executing it, right? Like, all these things work best if they're done in the course of the learning itself. And I guess the question is, some of our students, I think, learn those skills through osmosis, through their family structures, but a lot of kids don't have access to good role models and examples on that sort of stuff. And if we fragment the learning experience too much, I imagine we could lose that as well. And so, again, not something I think we actually do a good job today. So you could say, well, I'm actually not that worried about it because anything would be better than what we do today. I would say fair point. And it is something to think about how do we create coherence for that reason as well.
Michael, I think one of the, to the point earlier, kind of about the political change, right? I think this, figuring out how to change the system, right, as a parent is an incredibly daunting task, right? Figuring out how to navigate the system is super daunting in of itself, let alone thinking about kind of the forward-looking nature of it. And I felt super privileged to be part of a rally that the Black Mothers Forum, which is a group based in Arizona, focused on kind of homeschooling and making it more accessible to minority families. They took a March on Washington approach and had 200 or hundreds of families down marching on the Lincoln Memorial. But that takes a very special kind of activism and a very special kind of approach. And that's something that not every family is going to know how to do, be willing to do, or be tapped in to do. And I think as we kind of close up here, I'd be really curious as to what you see as kind of the top things that our listeners can do in order to make change happen in education.
Well, I'm glad you brought up that example, because I do think one of the biggest ones, like when 200 families, forget about Washington, D.C., just show up at the state capitol, like attaching real lives to a decision, it makes lawmakers think, right, around these questions, and it makes them remember who they're serving. And you don't exist to serve the institutions that have been there in the past. You exist to serve the individuals that are seeking progress. And so I think for those listening, anything you can do to, number one, enable a parent, a student to make meaningful progress is ground zero. And then anything you can do so that they can see that they have the power to further demand that progress, that is a right that they have as a citizen, as a taxpayer, as someone benefiting from public education. And public education isn't synonymous with the structure that they've had, but instead, their ability as the public to benefit and learn. And I think if they can just attach those two things together in even a small way, that would be meaningful, and just continue to build momentum. Because you all have exemplified this, right? Like I think to some of the work you did in Detroit, or have done in Grand Rapids or Arizona, et cetera, Justin, like when you give these families information, not just dollars, but information, they become the best spokespeople for what the progress that they need, far better than someone like me, because I'm not living in their situation. I'm not in their circumstance. And I think the biggest thing we know from the jobs to be done theory is that individuals seek progress in struggling circumstances. How do we unlock it? And that's what I would say to the practitioners listening. Keep unlocking the progress and connect it to how they can do more.
That's an awesome call to action. And along a similar lines, who are the education change makers you admire and want our listeners to know about? Who should they also listen to as they figure out their own voice and how to be outspoken?
Besides y'all. Let's say, I'll go Diane Tavner, who of course is my co-host on the Class Disrupted podcast. She ran Summit Public Schools, a charter school network, for 2 decades. Stepped aside and started her own company recently to help high school students navigate a future that goes beyond college for all, which I think is exciting, to really focus on purpose and passion. I would name Sal Khan, of course. I think he's done a lot for the world in terms of thinking about the power of mastery and personalization. I would name, I'll do one more, Amar Kumar, who our friend who's CEO and founder of KaiPod Learning. I think those sorts of networks to create sustainable micro school supply is going to be incredibly important. And so he's someone I think is doing some great work.
Michael, thank you so much for those recommendations on ways to be outspoken, ways to act, to make change, and change makers we should be paying attention to. It's been a pleasure to speak to you today. Thank you.
Hey, thank you both for the work you're continuing to do for learners all over. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael. We'll see you soon.